All right. Good afternoon, everyone, in person and online. My name is Sara Rouhi, Director of Strategic Partnerships at PLOS. Delighted to give you a bit of an update in collaboration with Scott and Ellen on new business models that have been fully launched now for almost a year. We're going to be starting with Ellen's pre-recorded presentation. And Ellen, if you don't mind just sharing your screen and then playing the recording, that would be how everyone will see that here in the conference center, and then Scott will go, and then myself.
Sarah, I'm going to play live because I actually don't have access to the pre-record. Okay.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right. So I'm going to do a share screen. Hello, everybody. Great to see you. And I'm here to talk about our new alternative open access business model, in the sense that University of California has been taking a particular approach. Whoops, I think I've got like something showing up on the screen here. I'm going to try to get rid of it. Sorry, all this was supposed to be. Well, I think I'm going to have to live with that. I don't know. There we go, guys. I'm going to be talking with you about an approach we've been taking at the University of California to incorporate research funds into the payment streams for open access agreements. So first of all, and I think Sarah and Scott and I are all going to follow sort of a similar format with these updates. Why did we take this approach? Why did we take approach of providing a mechanism for authors to contribute research funds when publishing open access? We took the approach because we recognized through a Mellon-funded study back in 2016 that for research-intensive universities in North America, library budgets would be insufficient to cover a full shift to open access publishing through an article processing charge model. Contributions from research grant funds were determined in this study as a way to address the gap. So this is the origin of what we at University of California call the multipayer model or multipayer workflow, since both the libraries and the authors with their grant funds, if they so choose, contribute towards the cost of open access publishing. So this schematic shows how the multipayer workflow functions. As noted, it's a workflow that allows authors to introduce their grant funds into the payment stream for open access publishing, along with library funding to support that publishing. Essentially, the way it works is that authors who elect open access are presented with a reduced APC and an initial library subvention, normally $1,000 per article. So that's the library's funding. The authors can select to contribute their grant funds to pay the remainder of the APC if they have sufficient funds. Or if not, they can select to have the library cover the rest of the cost of the APC. So in all our agreements, this multi-payer approach has been welcomed and actively used by University of California authors who lack grant funding, like graduate students, postdocs, and other early career or under-resourced scholars, and the many whose grant funds have expired. So where are we now, and what have we learned about our model? We now have 10 transformative agreements in place, 8 of which involve the multi-payer model. So we've successfully implemented this workflow with quite a range of publishers, including large and small, commercial and not-for-profit, subscription-based, and fully open access. And we're seeing authors who publish open access contributing their grant funds at rates that are overall what we projected and modeled for. We're also experimenting with other models as conditions arise where that makes sense, or it's essential to find a feasible set of financial terms based on the specifics for a given publisher. For example, with the ACM, and you'll hear about this from Scott later on this panel, we worked with a group of 5 institutions on the concept of that became ACM Open, a publishing output model that includes tiered bands of publishing. And we're very excited to hear from Scott about where that's gone and to see the success of the model. And we will also be soon working with Sarah on the various models that have emerged from PLOS since we established our agreement with them. Another example from the University of California is PNAS, where we worked on a new model that addresses the particular revenue structure at PNAS, and where we're piloting a model that involves a single rolled up, reduced publishing cost for the authors who elect open access. Though in this case, the full cost is not supported by the libraries. We call this approach a publishing services fee model. So we're trying to work with publishers in ways that meet their particular needs while remaining true to our overall strategic aims of containing costs while achieving 100% open access. So the key aspects of our agreements are that we are shifting subscription dollars to publishing open access. With all the models I've described, we're shifting our investment from paying for read access, or in the case of open access, pure open access publishers, we're joining in with publishing support there, to shift to paying towards open access. We do incorporate cost controls in these agreements. We begin with system-wide spend, so the library subscription dollars and any article processing charge that authors have already been paying from our campuses. The APC prices are discounted and fixed for the duration of the agreement. And then the price increases and the publishing volume growth are addressed by defining a cost corridor, essentially, a maximum and a minimum in which the total cost of the agreement remains, protecting both parties under the contract. We also work to ensure that authors control their publishing output through important mechanisms such as including copyright retention and Creative Commons licenses, and providing that authors who opt out of open access can deposit their manuscripts or have them automatically deposited into our open repository. We also aim very much to work with the diversity of publishers. We have a publicly available page about our prioritization process for these conversations. And we do want to support all types, kinds, sizes, and approaches of publishers. And we very much seek a consistency of the author experience through the year. So we're looking for agreements that provide 100% open access without any caps or any endpoints in the year when the support for open access can be made available. So what are we learning and what are our early observations? We're learning that authors appreciate and elect open access when it's supported, and that we can substantially increase open access through these agreements with sustainable costs. At UC, we went from single-digit adoption of open access by our authors to roughly half of authors adopting open access, which we think is a good rate, given the lack of funder requirements for this in the United States and how new these agreements are in the United States. It seems like a fairly significant cultural shift and a behavioral change for our authors that's been catalyzed by the availability of funding support through our agreements. We've also learned that authors will, in fact, contribute their grant funds at reasonable rates. The most common reasons authors specify when they do not contribute research funds is that they either have their research is unfunded or that grant fund has expired. So we do know that the library funding is reaching authors who want to publish open access, but otherwise would not have sufficient funds to do so. And we've been able to achieve this with contained costs for the libraries. We've learned a lot about workflow, metadata, identifiers, and messaging in terms of our approval processes for these various agreements. They're fairly streamlined and not overly burdensome, although we are looking for consolidation in the future as these number of agreements grow, including, let's say, through the open access switchboard data and other services that are available to help with consolidation. We're still learning more about author behavior and how to refine our workflows and our wording so that what we say to authors within the workflows is making sense. And we work closely with publishers on that, as Sarah can well tell you. We've learned that a wide range of publishers can build a mechanism to introduce grant funds into the payment stream, whether they're using a third-party service like RightsLink or on their own. It's not without time and effort, which Sarah will also probably be able to tell you, but it is with success. So where are we and what's next? In closing, I'll just provide you this graphic that shows that through existing University of California agreements, over 30% of our articles are eligible for open access publishing. This number would be over 40% if we conclude our advanced negotiations successfully, and we'd be at about 73% if we conclude agreements with all the publishers we're currently in conversations with. So I'm very pleased to be able to give you this update. I would love to hear from any of you who want to learn more about what the multipayer model can enable in terms of cost containment and making sustainable open access agreements for especially the North American context. And I'll turn it over to our next speaker, who I believe, Sarah, is Scott, right? All right, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Delman. I am ACM's Director of Publications. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you about the ACM open model. Before I do that, I'd like to just first take a very quick poll of everyone in the physical audience here. How many of you are familiar with the ACM open model? Have you heard of it and have a basic understanding of what it is? Okay, about half, a little over half. That's great. So what I'm going to do is jump to first slide, give you a little bit of information about the model itself. And I'm not going to go through every bullet here because of limited time, but I think there are a couple of things worth pointing out. And the first of these is that this model was developed in close partnership with a group of large research universities in the United States. University of California, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Carnegie Mellon University, the University of Minnesota, and Iowa State University. And when we started developing this model, we were looking at some of the things that many of the large commercial publishers were doing with their read and publish models, and we tried to create a model collaboratively that was a bit different. And probably the most important difference is that we decided to take a step away from the APC model. And so what we've developed is something called an unlimited read and unlimited publish model. And what that effectively means is that as an institution, you would enter into an agreement with ACM. Typically, that's a multi-year agreement, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And once you enter into that agreement, you're tiered based on your publication history. And during the term of that agreement, you have unlimited publication activity. So as long as your faculty and your students can get accepted into one of ACM's publications, it gets published on an open access basis in perpetuity. So that's the real fundamental difference. Another main difference is that we are really working from what we would call a cost-plus model. So ACM, as a nonprofit organization, is really looking at this transition, this transformation to open access, not as a way to increase our revenues or income streams, increase surpluses or profits, but rather to make sure that in a sustainable way we're able to continue publishing high-quality journals, conference proceedings, technical magazines, newsletters, and other types of peer-reviewed content that we have in our digital library. And that word sustainability is something that I think I've heard a lot about this week. I've heard it probably in about a dozen different sessions. And it means something different to every single publisher and every librarian that I've talked to. And one of the things I want to do is just sort of give a very, very clear definition. It's not in this slide. There we go. What does sustainability mean to ACM? So at the very beginning of the development work, back in 2018, we did a deep dive into the financials of publishing at ACM. What does it actually cost to run our publications program? Journals, magazines, conference proceedings, the platform itself. And that was the basis for what we consider sustainability. As long as we're able to continue running our publishing program and cover the expenses of publication, then for us, the model would be sustainable. You can't really see it on this slide, but I'm happy to send anybody that wants a copy of this article that we published to show you exactly what that means. In 2020, ACM's publications program generated just north of about $24 million. And on the expense side, on the bottom, it cost us about $23.5 million to run our program. So we generated a surplus of about 3%. Very, very thin margin for a publisher. And of course, that fits in with our nonprofit philosophy. And for us, it really is critical, and I think part of the model itself, that we were totally transparent about our finances. And one of the main reasons for that is when we looked at the customer base for the ACM Digital Library, all of those subscribers that have been subscribing for literally decades, we found that really only the top 1/3 of those institutions, so about 2/3 of our institutions would be what we consider read-only institutions. They're downloading articles, they're reading, but they're really not contributing to our various publications. And so that created a pretty fundamental problem for ACM. How do we rebalance the income stream in a way that once we're open access and virtually all of the peer-reviewed content is sitting in front of the paywall, what's the incentive for those read-only institutions to continue paying? So that was really fundamental to the development of the model. I'm going to jump back to to why we took that approach. The other main reason I think we took the approach we did was we heard very loud and clear from our authors that they didn't like paying APCs. They wanted open access, but they didn't want to go through the administrative hassles of paying the APCs. And we've learned over a period of about 7 or 8 years, we launched hybrid OA back in 2013, that to a certain extent, authors, when they're given the choice of opting in for hybrid publications, will generally not choose the hybrid option. They'll generally just remain behind the paywall. And so for ACM, it was really important to accelerate this transition. And we knew back in 2018, 2019, we were only at about 4% to 5% penetration of OA publications based on the author pays model, the author choice model, that if we really wanted to get to a full transition in roughly a 5 or 6 year period, it just wasn't going to happen through author opt-in APCs. And that was really one of the fundamental reasons we started working with this group of universities to develop the model. So where are we now? I'm going to sort of fast forward a little bit. We launched the model in January of 2020. Right at the end, the first group of institutions that signed on for the ACM open model were the University of California and MIT and Carnegie Mellon and Iowa State. And since that time, we've signed on about 150 universities worldwide. And I have a breakdown of that. It's actually publicly available on our website. But if you look at that list, you'll see that there's good representation from the United States, from Asia, from Europe, even from the Middle East. Some of the bigger research institutions have joined on. And most recently from China with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And altogether, that group represents about 15% of the total number of articles that we publish on an annual basis. So total number of articles is about 21,000. So we're publishing around 3,500 articles a year that are locked up into these ACM open deals, or authors are still paying some APCs. So APC option is still there. We're actively in negotiations with probably about 400 or 500 other universities. Some of these are going via consortia, some of them are direct discussions, and that group represents about another 15 or 20%. And if we were to conclude all of those deals tomorrow, then we would be closer to 30 to 35% penetration. The other thing to keep in mind with sort of the progress that we have is that the bottom tiers, those tiers where there's very little publishing activity, but they're essentially paying to read only, represents about 15% of the total number of articles that we publish. It's actually around 1,600 or 1,700 universities that represent about 15% of what we publish. And we could transition those tomorrow. And there would be no additional cost to those institutions. So we could accelerate that, and it's something that we're thinking about. But the initial thinking was to not do that at the beginning, because the model is really only sustainable if the big research-intensive institutions that are publishing with us actively join the model first. And so that's sort of where we are today. Also important for those of you not familiar with the model that we don't distinguish between hybrid publications or gold OA publications. We publish around 60 journals, hundreds of conference proceedings. Only about 6 or 7 of our journals are gold OA, but the model doesn't distinguish. If it's a peer-reviewed scholarly research article, then it's covered in part of the ACM open model. Conference proceedings or journals or magazines. So that's another kind of key characteristic. What have we learned? Well, we've learned a lot, certainly over the last couple of years. We've been active for about 18 months or so now in actively promoting and selling the model. I would say first thing is just a word of caution. Hopefully we won't have to deal with this again anytime soon, but I would caution you against launching a brand new business model for your entire publishing operation at the very beginning of a global pandemic. Yes. Fair enough. And in all honesty, I mean, I joke, but the uncertainty that surrounded the pandemic and the consequences, the financial consequences, while we've had overwhelmingly positive responses to the model itself, the fairness of the model, the equity of the model, transparency of our financial information, and how we're using those funds that are being generated from ACM Open. The reality is that uncertainty is the thing that everyone is dealing with, and it's very, very hard to get big research institutions to sign on to a new model when they don't know what the financial reality is going to be for them a year down the road, especially when these are multi-year agreements. So certainly that's been a challenge for us, but we do feel like things are moving very much in the right direction. For ACM, just to give you a little bit of context, the top 250 universities that we work with by publishing output represents about 50% of what we publish. And so if you look at the tier structure that we have, it's 10 tiers. The top tier, where you're publishing 75 or more articles a year, that tier represents, there are about 28 institutions worldwide, and about 40% of those 28 have already signed on to ACM Open. So some of the biggest institutions are really embracing the model, and we're really happy to see that, and of course that's where our focus has been. So going beyond library budgets, and this is something that Ellen talked about, but we've seen it in practice with institutions we're talking to who are saying, look, we want to sign on, we like the model, but our library budget isn't enough. So actively engaging with the departments, in our case, it's the computer science department, sometimes it's the dean of research or the vice provost of research, and starting to engage in conversations about cost sharing. I think we all know, because of the diversity of models that are out there, that if you're only looking at library budgets, transitioning all of the publishers that you're working with today is going to be virtually impossible. So engaging in those conversations early and often, I think, is going to be really critical for this transition to happen. Okay. What's on the horizon for us? So I would say technical challenges have been significant, far more than we knew when we set out with the model. Ellen alluded to this in her talk. Data and metadata are really hard. So even making that connection between an author and an affiliated institution is really hard. We do it by email domain name, for example, and many of our authors simply, when they submit their papers and they go through our rights process, they use Gmail accounts. And so the system doesn't recognize that they are from and affiliated with an ACM Open institution. So those kinds of details, re-engineering, if you're a publisher, re-engineering your production workflow, starting to use persistent identifiers. So we started just about a month ago requiring that all of our journal authors are actually going to be registering and depositing ORCID IDs with us, and that's going to help us tremendously on improving the quality of the data. Participating in institutional identifier initiatives like ROAR. So the technical difficulties certainly are significant. Another thing that's on the horizon for us is thinking about ways to accelerate this. Our board of directors took a decision back in June of 2020 that ACM would transition fully over to being an open access publisher within 5 years, and that we would do that using this model. And so this is, for us, it's a huge challenge, especially because of the economic situation resulting from the pandemic. But what it does is it gives us sort of, let's say, an added incentive, a motivation for taking some risks that maybe we wouldn't take otherwise. And so we're thinking about things like opening large chunks of the archive. We were looking the other day at, if we were to open from volume 1, issue 1 of every one of our publications up to 10 years ago, and having a 10-year sort of gap, that would represent about 53% of the articles that we've published since ACM was founded in 1947. And so things along those lines, understanding what the impact would be from your subscribing institutions if you unlocked half of the archive. But those are real discussions that we're having now. Developing the model for corporations, because in our area we publish technology content. Many of our authors are at industry organizations like Microsoft and Google, but the model that we've developed, this tier model, doesn't necessarily work for those kinds of institutions for a variety of reasons. So we're thinking about developing those kinds of models. And then the big question that we get often from our community is, when are we going to do a full flip? Today, the ACM Open model is optional. There is going to be a moment at some point in the future where it's no longer optional, where the decision to go fully OA is a requirement. What will be the impact on our subscribing institutions? And so those questions are really at the front of our mind at this point. And I think that's it.
All right, so let me pull my slides up. Can everyone see those okay online and in the room? Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sara Rouhi. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at PLOS. I'm really happy to give you an update on 10 months into our collective action model, Community Action Publishing, in much the same structure that Ellen and Scott just did. You might be familiar with PLOS. Everyone tends to know PLOS 1. We actually are a portfolio of 12 titles, 5 of which just launched this year. We had a bit of a dry spell and made up for it this year. The 3 titles that are directly implicated in community action publishing are biology, medicine, and sustainability and transformation. These are 3 highly selective titles. And that really speaks to what this model was trying to solve for. Basically, we wanted to test the notion that to publish highly selective content, there have to be really high APCs. That was never something PLOS was going to do from a mission-driven perspective, but at the same time, the cross-subsidy model leaning on PLOS 1 revenue is no longer sustainable. So we thought, let's try a collective action model that's predicated on community action, understanding that we have a different set of carrots and sticks than, for example, ACM or other publishers that have both closed and open content. So the first thing, it's good to hear Scott's process because ours was virtually the same. The first was to really look closely at the financials of all of those journals to figure out what do we need to cover our cost with a reasonable margin on top to stay sustainable. And that was the first piece of the work. And that took a bit of time on its own, but once that work was done, it really became a question of figuring out, in partnership with libraries, how do we distribute this cost fairly amongst many different kinds of institutions, from read institutions that likely will never publish in these titles, all the way to really research-intensive institutions. And then how do we ensure we're bringing the transparency to this whole process? So the revenue targets are public on our website. The fee structure is public on our website. And if you belong to an institution that doesn't participate, well, let me explain what you get first. So if an institution does participate in the model, they basically get unlimited publishing for their corresponding authors for the duration of the agreement. For institutions that don't join, their authors are charged non-member fees, and those are, you could call it just another name for an APC, but they are intentionally, we're raising those really aggressively to intentionally drive participation in the model, because in many cases, the cost of a non-member fee moving forward is going to be higher than what an institution would pay for 1 year of publishing. So we're trying to engage in different carrots and sticks to push this kind of collective behavior. I'm going to move fairly quickly. Okay, so this is why we took the approach, how it works. We're going to report annually on progress to targets. I think I've explained all of this. We won an award, which was really exciting, so we're putting that thing on every slide. And I think that actually the reason we were awarded this recognition, which was really powerful from our colleagues at ALPSP, is because the model so far seems to be working, not to jinx anything. So I'll share a little bit about that. So first, why we took this approach. As I mentioned, the cross-subsidy model was unsustainable. We knew that the communities publishing in those titles saw a lot of value in them. We were willing to walk away from them if need be. But between the feedback we were getting from authors and the kind of impetus to try models that are not APC based, we thought, okay, let's try and experiment with this. We knew to do this in the midst of a pandemic. I was working on this mostly through 2020. We had to be very collaborative with our library partners and make sure that we were bringing the transparency, understanding that everything PLOS does when we go to a library is ask for new money. So there's no historical spend with us in most cases. So we understood that was going to be a heavy lift. And much like the feedback to ACM, the transparency, the commitment to collaboration, the kind of accountability that's built into the model, particularly around redistributing fees once we hit the revenue target, has brought a tremendous amount of engagement during what's arguably the toughest budget landscape in a while. So as of the summer, so these numbers are a bit old, we saw a 42% increase in revenue for PLOS Medicine year over year. We saw a 51% increase in revenue year over year. And this is really what's making us, at least for the moment, think that this seems to be working. We will have a very different picture in about 8 weeks. So I hope to report on that in the new year. Because it was working for those two titles, we went ahead and said, how would we do this for a title that's never existed before? And sustainability and transformation is going to be our first foray into trying this with a new title. And then one of the big learnings we took away is the only way to get the word out on this is through consortial partnerships, and we're really grateful to our to the partners that you'll see on the screen and many others not on the screen who've kind of really led us to get this level of uptake globally. We won an award, I already told you that. All right, so what have we learned? I think I say this every time we talk about it. It is all about infrastructure, persistent identifiers, systems talking to systems, having the patience to do the data massaging and cleanup that comes with trying to disambiguate tens of thousands of authors globally. If you're willing to take the time for that, I think it really pays off, but you shouldn't underestimate the lift that brings. Flexibility has been really important around this. I remember hitting July of 2020 being like, we got this, we have a really nice tiering structure, it works really well. And then we talked to 10 or 15 institutions and consortia and we're like, all right, back to the drawing board on the tiering structure because it doesn't work. So if you're gonna work with libraries and say we want your input, you then actually, within reason have to act on that input. So that is we were able to bring flexibility to that. It was really fun explaining to libraries that there's no magic to tiering. You just try it and then see how it goes, and then you move things around. So we played with everything from 5 tiers to 25 tiers to everyone gets their own price, and settled on 12 because that felt psychologically pleasing and the numbers worked. So again, no magic wand to that. And then having partners who are willing to tell you this is madness, it doesn't work, or this is working really well has been critical as well. So what's next? We used the learnings to launch a second model this year called Global Equity that launched in May. And this model is trying to solve a very different problem. We're trying to solve the problem of geographic inequity and how waivers as a mechanism to deal with that in APCs don't work. So in fact, I'm doing a presentation tomorrow at 8:30 to dive into PLOS's waiver data to share why waivers are not the future of building inclusion into open access. So this model is particularly trying to address that challenge of can we move away from waivers to think about geographic inequity in a different way. We're in the process of evaluating uptake this year. Like I said, by the end of this year, we're going to have very different numbers around participation in the model, which I'm going to be very excited to report. We're also continuing our price transparency work. So if any of you have been involved in the Plan S price transparency framework, PLOS has been making this data public each year since last year. So we will commence the work for 2020 in the new year. And then we'll see how people respond to trying this kind of collective model for a new title. It's one thing to have an existing publication history to determine whether investing in this kind of thing is worthwhile. It's a different question for a new title. So we'll see how that goes. Everything is public. Happy to share how it's going for us, answer any questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Q&A. And I think we already had a couple in the chat in Zoom. So I think there was one question for you, Scott, around how you get the top 1/3 of institutions to participate.
So, most important. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? There we go. Most important to understand is, and if you go to our website, librarians.acm.org, you can kind of click through a couple of links and you'll see what the actual pricing is. It's public information, it's on the website. The tiers range from $8,000 on the bottom end up to $100,000 if you're one of the top tier research institutions. Sounds like an enormous amount of money, and it is. But when you look at the amount of publication output at those big institutions, and I'll just use a couple of examples. Tsinghua University is literally at the top of the list of about 4,500 institutions worldwide that publish with us. And Tsinghua publishes something on the order of between 225 and 250 articles a year with us, where the corresponding author is affiliated with Tsinghua. And then I think it's over 300 articles a year when you look at all of the affiliated authors with Tsinghua. And so on the one hand, How do you get those institutions to pay a lot more? It's about explaining the value proposition. And so there's I would say, a very common theme in when you're renewing subscription access licenses, and that is, what's the price? What's the price per download? What's the increased percentage? If it's more than 1 or 2%, we can't do it. And there is that sort of mindset built into those traditional negotiations with read-only licenses. With open access, it's a totally different value proposition. Of course, you're getting all the read access as well, but the value you're getting from the ability to have your authors publishing all of those articles in front of the paywall. When we looked at the data and we saw the increase in downloads, the increase in citations, it's noticeable. It's significant. It ranges from 1.5 to, in some cases, 4 or 5x the number of downloads and citations when the article is published in front of the paywall. And when you look at an institution like Tsinghua or Carnegie Mellon, which is actually number 2 on our list, and you look at how many articles they're actually they're publishing with us on an annual basis, and then you divide that into that top tier price of about $100,000 a year, it works out to a price per article of about $400 to $500. And so you compare that against what the APC prices are at most of the commercial publishers that are out there, that is typically anywhere from $2,500 to $3,000, or I think it even ranges up to about $12,000 for Nature. It's a huge value proposition for those institutions that publish a lot with us. So that's kind of the biggest sell in kind of the discussion around how do you get those big institutions. The other thing I want to just point out, because I'm looking at Philip Hewitt's comment here about corresponding authorship, is that, and that's a really valid point, is that the model is based on corresponding authorship. But at the same time, we look at those same institutions that join, and when they join ACM Open, we also take the article from all other affiliated authors. So if you're at University of California or MIT or Carnegie Mellon, and you're not the corresponding author on a paper, we're going to take the accepted manuscript version of that paper and we're going to deposit it in your institutional repository. So there are certainly some benefits that go to all of the affiliated authors, not just the corresponding author. Take the corresponding author to determine kind of pricing and tiering, and those are the articles that we unlock in our digital library.
Are we at time? No? We're okay? 4 minutes. Okay, cool. Yes, question, please. I'll repeat it. It's fine.
Hello? Yeah, you mentioned something that you have to have the top 100 or so, 400 institutions, like flip first or first. How are you segmenting out or prohibiting the bottom from wanting to flip?
Yeah, so 2 ways. In many of the direct conversations that we have with institutions, usually if it's what we would call a tier 10, so those kind of read-only institutions, when they reach out to us and they ask if they can join, we unfortunately say no, at this time you can't. Most of those institutions participate in a consortium, and they would historically access our digital library via consortium arrangement. And what we've been doing, we created a rule of thumb where in a given consortium, if I think it's 65 or 70% of the articles published across that entire consortium come into the deal. So if the top 2 or 3 institutions, if you've got a couple of tier 1s or a couple of tier 2s, come into that consortium and sign on to ACM Open, at that point, we've hit what we basically consider critical mass, and we say, okay, everybody else can come in. And so that's what we found. We could, as I said at the beginning, we could let 1,600 institutions have open access tomorrow. The problem is if we just do that, it doesn't get us any closer to sustainability, because the costs of publishing really are with those articles, the vast majority of the articles that are published on the top end of the tiered structure.
Yeah, to reiterate that too, I mean, there's a lot of, there's so many things I want to comment on in that answer. But the first is, so that's interesting in yours that because you have the subscription component, you're going to have to ask smaller places to kind of hold off. Yeah. Obviously, because PLOS's content is all open to begin with, we actually want really high volume on those read institutions because obviously we have the high dollar, high publishing institutions that we need to get for the model to work. But the small institutions are the ones that are going to get us over the revenue goal quicker. And so to have such a big chunk of the participants be in those smaller tiers is actually, low dollar, high volume. Will push us forward there. In terms of the corresponding and contributing authors, there's definitely corresponding author benefit in all these models. We've tried with Community Action Publishing to build some contributing author benefits in as well, since it's a collective. I won't get into the details because it'll kind of make your head spin, but we are trying to do that. The other piece that's a little different than other publishers' models that I'm aware of is at PLOS, we counted the publishing activity of both the corresponding and contributing author affiliations. And if you just stop to think about that for a second, that exponentially increases the institutional disambiguation, author disambiguation names. But what that allows us to do is broaden the base of institutions that we can reach out to and say, hey, you have a publishing history in this title, but it's not very often as a corresponding author, it's a lot as a contributing author. And you know what? You need to support that. You need to pay for that. And generally speaking, that's gotten a very positive response, but from the publisher side, it is more data work.
Sarah, just one more thing I actually wanted to add to that, because I think it's really important to understand the overall picture. So on the one hand, we're asking the top 1/3 to pay more. And as you go up the tier structure, it's a lot more. In some cases, it's not that much more. But we built into the model is this concept of a ramp down price, so that everybody in that bottom tier 10, over time, when we hit certain thresholds, starting with 20%, 20, 30, 40, 50, anybody that is actually paying over a certain dollar amount is going to be lowered. And so, frankly, what we're doing is we're decreasing the revenue that we're getting from those smaller institutions, and ultimately we're doing that because we don't want them to cancel. And so as more and more of the content becomes open access, if we bring the price down at sort of a proportional amount, the thinking is that the value will still be there, down to a point where the sort of steady state for us is that those tier 10s will pay about $2,500 a year for access.
The question was about how you integrate corporate into the model.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge open question today. Corporations represent about $3 million of revenue for us, not insignificant. And when we look at, there are about 100 corporations that subscribe to our full digital library. It's less than 5 that represent big publishing institutions like Google and Microsoft. So we haven't figured that one out yet, but it's absolutely critical. I mean, if all of that revenue went away, then that's going to put pressure on the rest of the model.
Yeah, that revenue can't go away. The read revenue really can't go away, and the government revenue really shouldn't go away. So those, I think, are challenges we both are going to have. Just want to check if there's anything for Ellen on the California Digital Library multi-payer model, either online or in the chat.
I'll go for everybody,
Yay.
including Ellen. Hi, guys.
Hey,
Hi, Stacey Burke, the American Physiological Society. So I'm really talking about, those proof points that Scott and Sarah both mentioned. And to Ellen, are there additional benefits that we should, as a publisher, be reporting to librarians? And if so, are you guys talking to them actively as you launch this? And I'm talking specifically about citations per article that's published with you, altmetric data, probably to a lesser extent, but are you being asked of that? And Ellen, is that something you're looking to add into your reporting structure?
You're asking about new metrics that could be used to assess these agreements?
That's right.
Yeah. So we are building a transformative agreement that's a model license that we hope to release, fairly soon, that does go into in-depth the reporting requirements, both to assess the agreement and also this kind of metrics that might help us understand the influence of them. So that's a work in progress for sure, and I'd be interested to continue the discussion, outside of this, since I know we're winding down pretty quickly. But a very, very strong interest, as Scott I think well knows, because we are constantly asking him and Sarah too about the reporting aspects of this to assess and understand what's happening with these agreements and their impact.
And I think we're at time. So thank you so much, Scott, Ellen, for joining me on this, because I roped you in last minute, I know. Thanks to everyone online and all of you here in person, and hopefully we'll see you at some of the other sessions soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.